An arrogant man mocked a woman's dusty old car in front of everyone. But minutes later, she walked out with the kind of power money can't buy. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the sleek pavement, its heat radiating in shimmering waves that danced along the concrete of a high-end car dealership on the edge of a suburban commercial strip. The glass facade of the dealership gleamed like a mirror, reflecting rows of meticulously polished luxury vehicles lined up like royalty on displays, one a symbol of success, speed, and social standing. The air buzzed with the low hum of passing traffic, the occasional bark of tires on asphalt, and the subtle click of leather shoes pacing across marble tile inside. Angela Daniels guided her car slowly into the lot, the engine of her well-worn sedan grumbling in protest under the relentless sun. The paint was faded from years of sun exposure, and the left mirror bore a small scratch, nothing major, just evidence of life. As she shifted into park, the car gave a tired sigh, settling into stillness. Angela turned off the engine and sat still for a moment, her hands resting on the steering wheel. The heat was thick, but her demeanor remained calm. UNBOTHERED. She stepped out with a grace that contradicted the condition of her vehicle. Her outfit was sharp-tailored slacks, a clean white blouse, and modest heels that clicked confidently against the pavement. Her natural hair was swept up into a high bun, neat and elegant. There was no need for extravagance. Angela wore composure like armor, and presence like perfume. At the far end of the lot, laughter broke the air. Rick Hamilton leaned against the side of a cherry-red sports car, sunglasses perched on his head, his blazer slung casually over his shoulder. Mid-40s, with a confident swagger that bordered on arrogance, Rick looked like the kind of man who measured worth in horsepower and cuffed. He had just returned from a test drive, the keys still spinning lazily around his finger as he chatted animatedly with a younger sales rep who nodded too eagerly at every word. His gaze drifted as Angela closed her car door and walked toward the building. The dusty sedan she'd arrived in caught his attention first, drawing a smirk to his lips. Then he noticed Herlone.com, walking with purpose. He scoffed. "Looks like someone took a wrong turn at the budget lot," he muttered, just loud enough for the nearby sales rep to hear. The young man laughed nervously, uncertain whether to correct the tone or go along with it. Rick didn't care. He was riding high on a cocktail of self-importance and adrenaline from the engine he'd just pushed down the highway minutes earlier. He sized Angela up quickly, letting his biases draw conclusions before she even made it to the door. Used clothes, old car, no man in sight. He turned back to the sales rep. "Let me guess she's gonna ask to sit in one, take a selfie, and leave without buying anything." He laughed again, louder this time. Angela heard him. The words were meant to reach her, but she didn't flinch. Her heels tapped rhythmically as she approached the dealership's entrance, not slowing even for a second. Her eyes briefly passed over Richcool, indifferent, unreadable, and then she was gone, swallowed up by the glass doors. Inside, the temperature dropped into a welcome chill, cool air conditioning wrapping around her like silk. She was met with a series of polite nods and murmured greetings from the staff. Some smiled with a familiarity that Rick, standing outside still chuckling to himself, hadn't noticed. Angela didn't pause at the reception desk. She didn't browse the cars. She walked straight toward a glass-walled office in the back of the showroom, her stride steady, her eyes ahead. One of the senior employees, a man with silvering hair and a navy tie, stood a little straighter as she passed, instinctively smoothing his shirt as though caught unprepared. "Good afternoon, Miss Daniels," he said softly. Angela offered a nod in return. "Good afternoon, James." The door closed behind her with a soft click. Outside, Rick continued his story, something about a golf trip and a friend with a Porsche, and failed to notice the subtle shift in posture among the employees who had seen Angela. One by one, shoulders squared and chatter quieted. Someone picked up a clipboard, someone else adjusted their tie. Respect had walked in, and the room had adjusted. But Rick still thought he was the center of it all. He still thought this was just another day, and he had no idea who had just walked past him. Rick had always considered himself a good judge of character, or at least, he thought he could spot someone who didn't belong. So when he saw the dusty, time-worn sedan crawl into the pristine dealership lot, he barely tried to hide his amusement. The car looked like it had fought its way through 10 years of city traffic and lost most of those battles. It wheezed to a stop like it was grateful for a break. From behind his sunglasses, Rick watched with a smirk as the driver stepped out. Angela Daniels didn't look flustered. She wasn't embarrassed by the condition of her car. She adjusted her blouse and slung her leather bag over one shoulder with the grace of someone used to walking into rooms where people judged her before she even said a word. Her poise was quiet but unmistakable, as though she didn't need the approval of anyone on that lot to feel whole. But Rick didn't see composure. He saw a black woman stepping out of an old car in a luxury dealership, and that was all he needed. To assume he was better, he scoffed audibly. Angela's heels clicked against the concrete, her steps unhurried. Rick pushed off the side of the sports car he'd been leaning on and called out, loud enough for his voice to slice through the sun-drenched air. "You lost, sweetheart. The used lot's down the road." There was laughter behind his words, not joy, but mockery. Sharp, condescending. Angela paused briefly, turning her head toward him. Her expression didn't change, no frown, no raised brows, just a steady, unreadable gaze that lasted a heartbeat too long, like she was looking past him, through him. Then she turned away and kept walking. Rick blinked. He'd expected a reaction, embarrassment, anger, a retort, but instead, she left him standing there like background noise, irrelevant. The silence made him uncomfortable, so he spoke again, this time to the young sales associate trailing behind him. "She's serious," he muttered, his voice dripping with smugness. "People really think they can just walk in here and buy one of these?" The associate offered a tight smile, clearly unsure whether to engage. "We get all kinds," he said diplomatically, before excusing himself quickly and disappearing into the building. Rick chuckled again and turned his attention back to the dealership doors, where Angela had just disappeared inside. He imagined the scene playing out, her wandering around, asking for prices, trying to act like she belonged, maybe asking for a payment plan that would be denied, or better yet, asking for a test drive just to feel like she'd touched luxury for once. He leaned against the car again, amused at his own narrative. But what Rick didn't notice was the shift in energy inside the dealership when Angela walked through the doors. A receptionist stood a little straighter. One of the senior salesmen nudged another, subtly nodding toward her. There were murmurs of "Good afternoon, Ms. Daniels," and "Welcome back." None of this was visible through the sun-tinted glass Rick was peering into, squinting like a man trying to solve a puzzle with the wrong pieces. Angela, meanwhile, offered polite nods as she walked through the lobby, her posture straight and her steps even. She didn't stop at the reception desk. She didn't browse the showroom. She moved with the familiarity of someone who had walked these floors many times before. Rick, oblivious, kept watching, still chuckling to himself. "She probably thinks the leather seats are free," with a smile, he muttered under his breath, half amused, half scornful. From his vantage point, he watched Angela pass the front desk, ignoring the receptionist entirely. That struck him as odd. Wasn't that where customers were supposed to check in? He saw her turn and walk directly toward a sleek glass-walled office in the back, the kind of office only senior staff used. Maybe she was a vendor, or a cleaner. No, too well dressed for that. He couldn't place it. One of the dealership managers, an older man in a navy tie, hurried to open the door for her. Rick tilted his head. The glass door closed behind her with a quiet thud, sealing her inside an office where the light caught the edge of a nameplate on the desk, but Rick couldn't make out the letters. Still, it gnawed at him. Something didn't add up. He stepped forward slightly, peering through the glass, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. Angela had taken a seat behind the desk, not in front of it. She opened a folder and began flipping through paperwork with the ease of someone reviewing contracts. And yet, Rick still clung to his assumptions. "Maybe she's someone's assistant," he mumbled. But the voice in the back of his head, the one that always stayed quiet until too late, was beginning to stir. Inside the office, Angela glanced up once, through the tinted glass. Her eyes met his for a fraction of a second. She didn't smile. She didn't need to. Inside the showroom, the atmosphere shifted the moment Angela stepped through the doors. It wasn't dramatic. There was no sudden silence or audible gasp, but it was there, subtle, unmistakable. A junior receptionist who had been casually scrolling through a tablet suddenly straightened up and adjusted her collar. A senior sales rep quietly stood, tugging at the cuffs of his suit, as if checking for wrinkles. Another employee nudged a colleague beside him, whispering under his breath, his eyes following Angela's measured steps toward the glass-walled office at the back. Rick, now standing just inside the doorway, watched all of this with narrowing eyes. He hadn't planned on coming back inside so soon. He was going to wait until someone fetched him. But curiosity had tugged him forward like a string on a hook. He couldn't put his finger on it, but something felt ... off. He stepped up beside one of the younger sales reps, a guy in his late 20s with an overly starched shirt and a name tag that read Evan. Rick nudged him with his elbow and nodded toward Angela's retreating figure. "So, what's the deal with her?" he asked, smirking. "She come in to deliver something." "Cleaning staff." Evan's face froze for a moment. His eyes flicked toward the office, then back at Rick. His posture stiffened. That's Ms. Daniels," he said, voice low. Rick squinted. "Ms. Daniels," Evan swallowed. "The owner." The words landed like a brick in Rick's chest, but he laughed anyway, half disbelieving, half defensive. "Owner," he echoed, incredulous. Evan didn't respond. He just nodded once, then busied himself with a clipboard that didn't need inspecting. Rick stood still for a beat, trying to process what he'd just heard. Owner of this dealership. That didn't make sense. She had just pulled up in a car. That looked like it belonged to a college student with debt. She hadn't looked around or asked for a tour. She hadn't even looked excited to be here. People like that didn't own businesses. Not ones like this. He looked toward the office again. Angela was seated behind the desk, flipping through documents with a slow, deliberate rhythm. Her expression hadn't changed. It was still calm, focused, composed. She sipped water from a tall glass beside her laptop. The sunlight filtering through the window lit the edge of her face, revealing the quiet strength in her jawline, the softness of someone who had learned how to hold power without having to flex it. Rick frowned. No. Maybe Evan had gotten it wrong. Maybe she was a partner, or someone's wife, or the daughter of the real owner. He found himself grasping at assumptions like lifelines, trying to hold onto the story in his head that made the world easier to categorize. Because if she was the owner, then everything he'd just said, everything he'd just done, was worse than a misunderstanding. It was a mistake. Still unsure, Rick slowly moved farther into the showroom. He passed by a row of luxury sedans, each one gleaming like a promise of prestige. His footsteps echoed slightly against the tiled floor. He was no longer swaggering. Angela, from her office, looked up through the glass. Their eyes met again, but this time there was something different in her gaze. It wasn't a glare, it wasn't anger. It was observation, cool, quiet, and precise, like she was watching him the way one watches a chessboard, already 3 moves ahead. Rick quickly looked away. He found himself pacing toward the sports car he had test-driven earlier, placing a hand on the hood like he needed to remind himself that he was still the customer here, that he still had the money, that he still had the upper hand. But behind him, one of the floor managers leaned in toward a colleague and muttered, "She doesn't even need to come in. You know, she only does it when she wants to check the culture." Rick caught that phrase, the culture, and it lit a strange, sinking feeling in his stomach. He looked around again. Every employee he saw now seemed more alert, more polished, not in fear, but in respect, like a soldier standing taller when a commander walks into view, out of fear of punishment, but pride in being noticed. Angela wasn't just known here, she was respected, admired. He stared at the office again. This couldn't be right, and yet, as he watched a sales associate enter the office and Angela greet them with a nod, sliding a document across the table for review, the truth became harder and harder to deny. Rick was suddenly aware of how quiet the room had become around him, how his own presence, once loud and joking and dominant, now felt muted, out of place. The woman he had mocked openly, confidently, and with smug condescension was seated in the only office in the building with a nameplate on the door, and he still hadn't even read what it said. Minutes passed, but to Rick, it felt like a slow drip of discomfort. He loitered near the receptionist's desk, trying to appear relaxed, casually tapping his fingers against the chrome trim of his phone. He had already run out of small talk and half-chuckled charm. The employees no longer seemed eager to entertain him. There was a quiet efficiency to how they moved now. With stolen glances toward the back office, Rick's test drive paperwork sat ready on the counter. The lease for the graphite gray sports coupe he had bragged about over the phone just 20 minutes earlier. A car that, by all accounts, he was ready to buy. This was supposed to be his victory lap, but something in the air felt different. he couldn't quite place it. The receptionist, a young woman with almond eyes and a practiced smile, looked up and gave him a nod. "Mr. Hamilton, you'll be meeting with our general manager shortly to finish the transaction." Rick smiled, sliding his sunglasses back onto his face with an exaggerated coolness. "Perfect. Just waiting on the boss man," he said with a wink, then turned away to make a phone call, mostly to fill the silence. He spoke louder than necessary. "Yeah, I'm at the dealership, just about to close the deal. These guys can't wait to hand me the keys." He laughed into the receiver, forcing the sound. "Waiting on the manager. Shouldn't be long. I'll be out of here with the new toy before you know it." And then, behind him, the soft click of a door opening cut through the hum of the showroom. Rick turned around slowly, still half grinning till he saw her. Angela Daniels stepped out of the glass-walled office, a sleek leather folder tucked neatly under her arm. Her posture was composed, professional. Her blouse remained crisp despite the heat outside, and her heels made a gentle staccato as she crossed the floor. She walked with calm authority, unapologetic, unhurried. Rick's grin faltered. He stood, but awkwardly, as if his body had forgotten what confidence felt like. Angela came to a gentle stop in front of him, extended her hand with poise, and offered a warm smile, not mocking, not cold, just professional. "Mr. Hamilton, I'm Angela Daniels, owner of this dealership. Let's go over your financing options." The words hit him like a gut punch. For a second, Rick couldn't speak. He just stared, mouth slightly open, trying to fit her presence into the shattered mold of the story he'd told himself about her. The owner, she was the boss man. His throat went dry. "Oh yeah, Miss Daniels," he stammered. "Wow, I didn't, I thought." He laughed nervously, reaching for anything to say. "Those are nice shoes," he blurted out. "Sharp, really sharp." Angela offered a polite smile, her eyes unmoved. "Thank you. Shall we take a seat?" Rick followed her back toward the office he had spent the last half hour ignoring. The same office he had watched her enter with confusion. Now, every step he took behind her felt heavier than the last. Each stride chipped away at the image he had built of himself, the one where he was the alpha, the buyer, the power in the room. Inside. Angela gestured toward the chair across from her desk. Rick sat, his posture stiff. The air in the office was still cool, but his palms had started to sweat. Angela opened the folder and began reviewing the numbers with smooth precision. Her tone clear, confident, and concise. "We've run your credit check. Everything looks in order. Now, regarding your monthly payment options." Rick wasn't listening. Not really. His thoughts were racing, too loudly rattling around the inside of his skull like a marble in a glass jar. He kept hearing his own words echo back at him. "You lost, sweetheart. Used lots down the road. What kind of idiot did that? What kind of fool mocked a woman, this woman, without knowing who she was?" He tried again, chuckling nervously. "Listen, about earlier, I was just joking around. Didn't mean anything by it. Just messing around." Angela didn't look up from the folder. "That's fine," she said evenly. "Let's stick to the terms of the agreement, shall we?" The silence that followed was devastating. The balance of power had shifted completely, but Angela didn't need to gloat. Her power didn't come from dominance or volume, it came from the quiet certainty of someone who had been underestimated her whole life, and had learned how to win without ever raising her voice. By the time the transaction was finalized, Rick could barely meet her eyes. He signed the papers quickly, almost robotically. The sports coupe still awaited him outside, but it no longer felt like a victory, it felt like a lesson he hadn't seen coming. Angela stood, extended her hand again with the same polite professionalism. "Thank you for your business, Mr. Hamilton. Drive safely." Rick mumbled something that might have been "you too," then hurried out of the office like a man trying to outrun shame. Angela watched him go. She didn't smile, she didn't sigh. She simply turned, sat back at her desk, and resumed her work like nothing had happened at all. But to Rick, it had. The silence in Angela's office was different now. Not tense, not awkward, just heavy. Rick sat across from her, pen still in hand, the lease agreement before him, but he hadn't signed yet. The leather chair he occupied, once a throne in his imagination, now felt like a witness stand. He shifted slightly, cleared his throat, and glanced up to find Angela calmly reviewing the final page of the contract. She hadn't scolded him, hadn't raised her voice, hadn't even brought up what he said earlier, and somehow, That made everything worse. Her professionalism was pristine, unshaken. That was the power of her presence. Angela didn't need revenge. She didn't need to throw his words back at him. She simply allowed them to exist and watch undeniably and let them echo in Rick's own mind where they stung the most. She flipped through the folder one more time, making a small note in the margin. Then she looked up, her tone as neutral as ever. "Still interested in the vehicle, Mr. Hamilton?" she asked, her words calm, her gaze level. "Or would you prefer to find a dealership where you feel more comfortable?" The question hung in the air. It wasn't laced with venom. It wasn't passive-aggressive. It was worse than that. It was genuine. Angela was giving him an out, a dignified escape, a moment to leave the room and pretend this hadn't happened, a chance to preserve the last scraps of his pride. Rick blinked, then looked down at the paper again. His mouth opened, but nothing came out at first. "Still interested," he mumbled finally, barely louder than the hum of the air conditioner. Angela nodded once, as if she had already known the answer. "Very well." Her pen glided effortlessly across the bottom of the page as she added her signature, the same way she'd done for dozens of other clients. Her posture never shifted. Her voice remained smooth and composed. She didn't need to make him squirm. He was doing that all by himself. Outside the glass walls, the staff moved with quiet attentiveness. They weren't whispering, but something unsaid passed between them, a shared look, a barely there smile, a subtle shift in expression that said they knew. They had seen Rick's smugness earlier, heard the way he laughed when Angela first stepped out of her old car, and now they watched as he sat, hunched and hollowed out, his bravado gone, his mask cracked open, but none of them laughed, not one. They followed Angela's example, professional, poised, composed. She was the standard, and they matched her tone. Angela slid the folder across the desk and stood, smoothing the front of her blouse. "A service rep will bring the car around shortly," she said. "We've included a complimentary detailing and full tank of gas. Should be ready within 15 minutes. Rick stood too awkwardly. His hand hovered between a wave and a handshake, unsure what to offer. He ended up rubbing the back of his neck, eyes darting toward the floor. "Thank you," he muttered. "Really? And about earlier?" Angela tilted her head slightly, giving him her full attention. He froze again. There was no anger in her face, no satisfaction, no I-told-you-so, just silence, the kind that waits not for an apology, but for reflection. Rick faltered. "I shouldn't have what I said. Look, I didn't know who you were." Angela smiled then, just faintly. "You shouldn't have to know who someone is to treat them with respect." The words weren't sharp, they weren't even personal, they were a truth too big to argue with. Rick nodded slowly, as if every syllable had just settled into his bones. Then, quietly, he said, "You're right." Angela turned to the door, and Rick followed behind. As she stepped out, a few employees nodded at her. She acknowledged each of them with a soft thank you or a polite carry-on, like a conductor keeping the orchestra in harmony. Rick kept his head down as he walked toward the front of the dealership. At the curb, the sports car gleamed under the sunlight, doors freshly polished, engine purring like a big cat ready to stretch. A young man from the service bay handed him the keys with a faint smile. "Enjoy the ride, sir." Rick murmured his thanks and slid into the driver's seat. The leather interior was pristine, the dashboard lit up like a cockpit. Everything about the car was exactly what he'd imagined, and yet it didn't feel like a victory anymore. He adjusted the mirror, catching a glimpse of the showroom behind him. Through the glass, he could see Angela returning to her office, unbothered, in control, carrying the kind of grace that couldn't be bought or faked. Rick exhaled and looked down at his hands, gripping the wheel. This wasn't just about a car. It never was. It was about perception, about assumption, about how easily a man like him could laugh at a woman like her, thinking he was above her until the truth showed him just how far below he actually stood. As he pulled out of the lot, he wasn't smiling, but he was thinking, and sometimes that's where real change begins. The sports car had been a statement. That was how Rick had seen it, a way to show the world who he was, or at least who he wanted them to believe he was. But the car he now eased off. The dealership lot wasn't the flashiest model. It was still sleek, still expensive, but toned down, more restrained. No custom spoiler, no chrome finish, just a clean graphite body and smooth, quiet power under the hood. It wasn't the car he'd bragged about over the phone. It wasn't the one he'd imagined cruising down the boulevard in, drawing looks of envy and admiration. But somehow, it felt more appropriate now. Rick kept his grip loose on the steering wheel as the car turned onto the main road, his eyes scanning the rearview mirror out of habit. Behind him, the dealership's glass facade gleamed under the setting sun, the reflection of orange clouds catching in the curved windows like fire in crystal. And there, behind the glass, she stood. Angela, her silhouette framed in the showroom window, one hand resting lightly on her hip, the other holding a tablet against her side. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't frowning either. Her expression was unreadable, serene and still, like stone carved by years of pressure and grace. She watched him go, not with contempt, not with satisfaction, but with the steady gaze of someone who had seen this before, someone who knew how the story usually went and how it needed to end. Rick glanced away quickly, almost as if ashamed to meet her eyes again, even from a distance. For a long while, he drove in silence. No music, no calls, just the quiet hum of tires against asphalt and the faint ticking of his own thoughts, turning over and over like gears in a locked box he hadn't expected. Today, to teach him anything, he came for a car, but he was leaving with a mirror to the parts of himself he hadn't questioned, the part that made him think a dusty car meant a lesser person, the part that laughed too easily at people who didn't fit his narrow mold of success, the part that looked at a confident black woman and assumed she was an outsider when in fact, she was the one who built the room he'd been standing in, and she hadn't needed to raise her voice to make that clear. She hadn't needed revenge, or cruelty, or theatrics, just presence, just patience, just power, carried with quiet assurance. He thought again about the moment she asked him, "Still interested in the vehicle, or would you prefer to find a dealership where you feel more comfortable?" And how those words had wrapped around his chest like a weight. He hadn't slept through a civil rights course or grown up in ignorance. He'd told himself he was a good guy, someone who didn't see color. But the truth of it was uglier, more ordinary. He had seen color, and he'd made a judgment anyway. Back at the dealership, Angela turned away from the window. Another customer was being greeted at the door, a middle-aged woman, hair tied back, eyes scanning the showroom with both curiosity and caution. Angela nodded to a nearby rep, who stepped forward with a practiced smile and easy warmth. The dealership hummed back to life. Phones rang. Doors opened and closed. Engines rumbled to life for test drives. Staff moved like clockwork, like they had done it all 1,000 times before. Angela returned to her office, tablet in hand, another file waiting on her desk. For her, this wasn't a rare day. This was just Tuesday. She didn't seek moments to prove herself. She didn't live for comeuppance. What mattered to her was the consistency, the principle that you show up with dignity, do your work well, and let your presence be its own response to prejudice. She sat down, tapped her tablet, and began typing a quick reply to an internal email. There was another dealership opening 2 states over under her name, another branch of the legacy she was building, not in noise, but in excellence. Outside, Rick merged onto the highway. The wind moved quietly through the windows. His mind replayed the afternoon like a silent film, frame by frame. The laughter, the assumptions, the twist, and the weight of it all. Now that it had landed, maybe no one would know what happened today. Maybe he'd never tell the full story. But something inside him had shifted. Sometimes, the loudest lessons come from the quietest voices, and Angela's voice, measured, calm, unshakable, would echo in his memory far longer than any engine, roar, ever could. Respect isn't about the car someone drives or the color of their skin. True power doesn't need to announce itself. It walks in, gets things done, and leaves an impression that lasts forever. Themes and moral lessons: never judge someone by appearances. True success is quiet, composed, and undeniable. Racism and arrogance reveal more about the person who holds them than the one they target. Grace and professionalism are the ultimate comeback.